What's up, YouTube? This is Too Raw for TV. All right, so this is that time of year, um, every 4 years, where I begin to focus more on politics. We are heading toward the political season, which will be the fall of this year. We're still in summer, not even that far into summer, but we already had a presidential debate. The earliest a presidential debate has ever been held by far. Usually they're held after Labor Day. Um, and beginning next week, we will have the Republican National Convention, which will be held in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And during this convention, we will see key Republican speakers, those elected, usually notable people who support the Republican Party. And on the penultimate night, we should most likely see the nomination of the vice presidential candidate. We still don't know who that will be. And the final night, we will see the nomination and more than likely a speech given by Donald Trump, the presumptive nominee. A month from now will be the Democratic convention. Will be held in Chicago. When I think of Democratic conventions in Chicago, I think of the tumultuous one in 1968, which hurt the Democratic Party. And the Democratic Party has already taken its lumps with Joe Biden. We will more than likely, well, I can't even say more than likely. Right now, we're in line to see the renomination of Joe Biden as the nominee, but things are fluctuating as we speak. But in this video, I want to talk about how both political parties over the last several decades have cannibalized their own to become far more extreme and intolerant versions of their former selves. The Democratic Party was formed back in the late 1820s. The party was largely organized by Martin Van Buren, who went on to become the vice president in the second term of Andrew Jackson. I think his first vice president was John C. Calhoun, who grew to bitterly dislike Jackson. Matter of fact, Jackson threatened in 1832 when the state of South Carolina threatened back then, 3 decades before the Civil War, to secede from the Union. He said that if they did that, he would hang everybody in the state of South Carolina, including John C. Calhoun, his vice president. But in the second term, suffice to say, he needed a new number two. It was Martin Van Buren. In 1836, Martin Van Buren became president. And from a period of 1836 until 1988, he was the last vice president to directly succeed the president, or his president as president of the United States, directly succeed. Remember, Richard Nixon lost in 1960 when he ran, but won in 1968. So look, the Democratic Party used to be the party of slavery. It was pro-slavery. Let's not forget that. But it was the party of the little man. It was the party of the rural farmer. Let's be honest, it was back then the party of the poor white man. And it was against the wealthy, or it positioned itself against the wealthy. It was for the expansion of federal power, the expansion of the powers of the presidency. And it was for expansionism in general. The Republican Party didn't form until the early to mid 1850s. Some disaffected Whigs who, and by the way, the issue of slavery pretty much helped to break up the Whig Party. Because you had some Whigs who were pro-slavery, who bolted to the Democrats, some of them, but most of them either just went on to fractionalize and support offshoot parties until cooler heads prevailed. But a lot of them went, include Abraham Lincoln, who was a Whig. When I say Whig, I mean WHIG. They went and formed this new dang-fangled party called the Republican Party. And at that time, they were pro-business, as they are today. They were against the expansion of the federal government, and they were vehemently anti-slavery at that time. Now, we know there's been some changes over the years, over the decades. Let me start with the Democrats. Now, starting in about I would trace it back to 1948. Before that, there was always an alliance between what I would call the Northern Democrats and the Southern Democrats. And they always had to tiptoe a line. And it peaked under the presidency of FDR, Franklin Roosevelt. Now, Roosevelt was a liberal, but he knew that he needed the support of Southern Democrats to get anything passed. Back then, and it's still pretty much the same way, but especially then, the Democrats were the majority party in the United States, which meant that they almost always had control of of the legislative branch of government. They almost always had control of the House of Representatives. And just by a slightly lesser margin, they generally had control of the Senate. So when there was a Democratic president, especially a popular one, they were more successful in getting their legislation passed. We've had exceptions to that rule. The 1920s, for example, was a hugely Republican conservative era. But FDR, although a lot of his New Deal programs did help Black Americans who were struggling more than anybody else during the Great Depression, which caused them to largely defect to Roosevelt on the presidential level, though many Black people still voted Republican on a state and local level. He made sure not to appear to be too civil rightsy, if you know what I mean. He never really did much as far as federal appointments of Blacks. He didn't speak out about Black people and the segregation of the armed forces or military, federal government as far as jobs. After Theodore Roosevelt tried to do some progress in that area, he was a Republican, but a progressive one. Woodrow Wilson did a lot to reverse that, and Franklin Roosevelt, who was Theodore Roosevelt's distant cousin, didn't really do anything to improve that. But in 1948, his successor, Harry Truman, did try to, on at least a minor level, appeal to Black voters. Because remember, FDR almost always was assured election. Harry Truman, not so much. Harry Truman recognized that Blacks would be a big part of his constituency, even though he had a past history of being racist himself. There's actual evidence of him being a racist in a letter that he wrote to his wife back in 1919, where he referred to us as the N-word, Asians with the terminology that's offensive. But anyway, politically, he needed Blacks. So he appealed to Black people. And there was some mention of civil rights on the plank. That was enough to get Southern Democrats to bolt the party, right? And Harry Truman ran for re-election without much support from Democrats in the South. Matter of fact, many state governors, all of them were Democrats back then. In the South, most of them didn't support him. I think one of the few was the governor of Georgia. But he won re-election. So that showed the liberal wing of the party, the liberal and moderate wing of the party, hey, we can win elections without the support of the South. So slowly what you started seeing in the 1950s onward was a growing strength in the liberal wing of the Democratic Party. Adlai Stevenson was a liberal, not a civil rights champion, but he was a liberal. But he still had the little balancing act of needing a Southern Democrat on the ticket. So he ran with a man named, I think his name was John J. Sparkman, who was a segregationist, but not by policy he was, but he wasn't a vehemently militant racist. But still, he was a segregationist. But in 1956, he ran with a Southerner named Estes Kefauver of Tennessee, who was a liberal. So slowly you're seeing the Democratic Party become more liberal. John F. Kennedy, Massachusetts, Northerner, wasn't really that liberal, but he had appeal to moderates, and he has, he had other things going against him, the Catholic thing at the time, and he had his health issues he had to cover up, whatever. And he ran with Lyndon Johnson, who was a Southerner, but by this point in time, Lyndon Johnson was starting to become more and more of being seen as a champion of civil rights, although privately he was a bigot, But the point is, I'm trying to get you to understand, the Democratic Party was starting to slowly, especially on the national level, slide more and more into being the party that we recognize today. Lyndon Johnson becomes president after Kennedy's assassination. And Lyndon Johnson was the Senate Majority Leader for many years, probably the most, along with Mitch McConnell. And I would say Lyndon Johnson was a lot more politically savvy than Mitch McConnell, more powerful in general. He was very, very persuasive in getting things passed in the House and the Senate. And he used his prestige, he used his popularity, initial grand popularity, and the post-sympathy wave of Kennedy's assassination to get a lot of legislation passed, including the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. That pretty much helped to solidify the Democratic Party as becoming predominantly dominated by the liberal and moderate wings of the party. At the same time, the Republican Party was undergoing a sweeping change. By this point in time, after the election of 1960, which was won by Kennedy over Richard Nixon by a slim margin, it was after that election that the Republicans pretty much started giving up trying to compete for the black vote. So in 1964, finally something happened. From 1936, when Alf Landon ran, who was a conservative, but he lost horribly to Roosevelt, only winning 2 out of 48 states. From that election until 1964, the moderate and more liberal wings of the party dominated. All of the nominees, Wendell Willkie, Tom Dewey twice, Dwight D. Eisenhower, Nixon initially in 60, they were all liberal to moderate Republicans, but they weren't winning anymore. After 1960. So Goldwater and the GOP were able to secure the nomination over Nelson Rockefeller, who was a moderate Republican who did not have wide support amongst many factions in the party. So Goldwater, the conservative so-called extremist, was nominated. By the way, at this convention, the GOP convention in 1964, did you know that black conservatives were actually beaten on the floor? I can't say black conservatives, black Republicans at that convention, if you look it up, they were attacked, verbally accosted, physically accosted, and told to shut up because many of them had issues with the fact that the Goldwater campaign was against the Civil Rights Act. Now, he claimed it was because, he was against the federal government legislating something like that to states. But come on. Essentially, he was trying to appeal to a certain demographic of voters. And they were cajoled into shutting up and not saying anything. Uh, so that probably helped to usher the last few black Republicans into the Democratic fold. That's something that the Republican Party don't tell you. It was after this time that Richard Nixon, in 1968, on a tepid level at least, began to adopt a Southern strategy, right? But to be honest with you, the Republican that really adopted the Southern strategy more than others, that really did it, was Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan, when he announced his candidacy in 1980, if I remember correctly, or at least he held one of his first campaign rallies, it was at Philadelphia, Mississippi, if I'm not mistaken. And he chose that site for a specific reason, because he, rallied against states, about states' rights and all that type of stuff. It was coded language. Philadelphia, Mississippi, if I'm not mistaken, I believe that's the site where those campaign workers, those civil rights campaign workers, I think it was a black guy, I think his last name was Cheney, Schwerner, and something else. I think it was two white guys and a black guy named last name Cheney. They all disappeared. They were found murdered. Their car burnt out. They were attacked by some racist sheriffs, some hicks, and beaten to death, killed. And Reagan chose that site on purpose. And, that's when you started seeing more of an influx of Democrats, conservative Democrats, on the national level voting more and more Republican. But on the state and local level, it was a slower process. You still had blue dog Democrats. You still had, in the 80s and 90s, you still had people like, what's his name? Trying to think of that senator from South Carolina. Not Strom Thurmond, but the other one. I forget his name. He was a Democrat, if I'm not mistaken, but he was a conservative Democrat. You still had a lot of conservative Democrats, but more and more the Republicans, especially after 1994 takeover by the GOP, you started seeing more and more blue dog Democrats retiring or getting voted out of office and replaced by young Republicans who are still there in many cases. The same thing happened in the Democratic Party. Conservative Democrats that were running in districts that were unfavorable for them had to retire. Or you started seeing liberal Republicans having to retire because they didn't have the support that they needed, or they were being defeated in their primaries by a new, more conservative Republican Party, or they were losing in the general election because the Republican base wasn't coming out to vote for them. And I think the final curtain on that was sometime in the mid 2000s. So this was the takeover, the changing of the parties. To be honest with you, I could do a 2 or 3 hour video going into detail about this. I already talked for 18 minutes. I'm trying to be concise and just go to the main points. But the cannibalization is more of this. With the GOP, for a long time, the Cold War between the Soviet Union, then Soviet Union, United States, it gave us an enemy to rail against, right? But after the decline and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, well, a lot of war hawks who tend to be very conservative and usually Republican didn't have any outward enemies to look at anymore or to attack. So, because it's their nature, they began to attack within the Republican Party. They're getting to attack their own. So what did you start seeing? You start seeing people, Pat Buchanan, others, they started railing against those who were pro-abortion. You can't be Republican and be pro-abortion. You You can't be Republican and pro-gun. You can't be Republican and this, that, and the other. And slowly and surely, but surely, you started seeing more and more Republicans ouster liberal and moderate Republicans from the party. Elizabeth Warren used to be Republican. You know, a lot of these so-called Democrats in the past used to be Republicans. A lot of Republicans today used to be Democrats. If I'm not mistaken, Mitt Romney was once a Democrat. You see how that works? It's the parties have become much more extreme. The Democrats have done it for a long time as well. The progressive wing, it's happening right now as we speak. It's going on even further. It's going on right now in the Democratic Party. If you don't support certain lifestyles, if you don't support this, then the other, you'll be shamed and ostracized and pretty much pushed. Either they cajole you and bully you to try to support something, or like many people, they're going outside the party. Look what's happening with black men. Many black men, they hate what's going on with the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party, you can make a strong argument. Daddy Lyndon Johnson took the power out of the black man in the household. I mean, to be honest with you, the Democratic Party makes it more profitable for black women to look upon the government for assistance, look upon the government for trinkets, look upon the government for all these programs, subsidized programs to help them out financially, than a man. So they don't really need a man, not financially. And many men resent that. The Democratic Party, in my opinion, would prefer the black household to be divided. They don't want a man and woman, black man and woman married. So they love this division within the community. Black men resent that. A lot of us, we resent the fact that we are often attacked by so-called leading Democratic personalities for not stepping up and all this other BS and being more conservative in our thinking and in our politics. And that's why you have more and more black men. I hate, it is what it is, either voting third party, sitting this one out, being independent, or even voting Republican. So over the years, this is what's been going on with Obama. You know what I'm saying? The Republican Party went even further, starting with the Tea Party movement. And you could argue with Obama that both parties further became more extreme. The Tea Party movement pushed the Republican Party even further than they were during the Bush years. And post-Obama, the Democratic Party has become even more extreme as far as at least what they ostensibly support. But you know what's changed with both parties? Or what hasn't changed, I should say? Both parties are paid and bought for by the elites. And by the way, this is the hypocrisy of baby boomers. Post-Watergate Democrats, right, came into the Congress in 1974 because it was a huge Democratic landslide that year because of Watergate. And they came in there young, 25, 30, 35, 40-year-olds. And they wanted to get rid of everything that was existing. There was already this merit system in place where the longer you were in Congress, you're the one that chaired these committees. They changed the rules so that, it was by caucus vote. So whoever had the most votes got to chair these committees. So you had younger people starting to chair committees, more liberals, right? So they were ideologues, and they were going to change everything. But it's funny. Over the years, especially into the 1980s. These supposed bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, idealist young whippersnappers who were supposed to change Washington, they became more corrupt than any of the prior Democratic or Republican, on both sides. They became much more corrupt than any prior generation of politicians. They enriched themselves more than any other generation. They grew corrupt and they became the status quo. And here they are now in their 70s and 80s, holding on to power, not wanting to cede. And we are stuck in this political quagmire today where you have people in their 80s holding on to a job like the Pope. But anyway, I could go on and on and on in this one, but tell me what you guys think.